Hello and welcome to the Underhive. We are back with some more How to Command the Death Guard, or rather in this case, how do the balance data slate changes along with the points changes ready for the Arcs of Omen Warzone affect the Death Guard meta, or the meta in terms of being a Death Guard player. So first and foremost, let's take a look at the universal rule changes from the balance data slate. The big one, of course, is Armour of Contempt is gone. Which I imagine is probably one of the reasons you've looked at this video. Now, we will cover over some of the other interactions of that rule going away a little bit later on in the video, but on a base level, just the fact that it's gone away isn't a straight negative. Of course, it is a loss of durability to probably every model in your army, if not most models in your army, and of course, that is a negative. But on the flip side, there have been some point decreases to compensate for that, and you're also not going to come up against Armour of Contempt anywhere near as often. There are still some factions that have access to it in a broad nature, and there are still plenty of factions that can dish out a buff to a unit or two that has a very similar, if not identical, effect to Armour of Contempt. So you will still see it, but the fact that it's gone broadly isn't necessarily a bad thing for the Death Guard, because there's not a ton of AP in Death Guard in the higher ranges. Having a broader access to sort of 1-2 AP is now going to be more relevant if you want to build in that direction. On top of that, aircraft rules have changed. So you can still only have 2 aircraft in a strike force mission, 2 flyers, but they must start off the board now. Now, that's not as big a deal as a Death Guard player for yourself, because flyers are not that common a pick in the Death Guard, though you can pick them. But it is going to be more of a deal for an opponent that wanted to bring flyers. Perhaps they're not going to fit that Harpy in the list now because it's not going to do anything turn 1. They're not going to bring those Scions in a Valkyrie for Guard because they're not going to be able to get out and do things as early as they might want to. So that, I think, is a buff to the way Death Guard play, in that you're not going to have to worry about an aircraft Alpha Strike as early as turn 1. It's going to have to be that bit later in the game. And indirect fire is essentially unchanged for the Death Guard. The only thing that's really doing that's a Plague Burst Crawler. Ultimately, it's gone away for the Guard. Their buffs to indirect fire have gone away, but of course they have had some other buffs with their more recent codex which compensates for that. So I don't think Guard are particularly worse off. If anything, they're actually one of the stronger factions at the moment, in my opinion. And the bodyguard rule basically hasn't changed from where it was in the previous Warzone. You need to have at least 3 models. Certain units will have bodyguard abilities for a given character. They won't need 3 models then, but otherwise you're going to need 3 models in a squad, or you're going to need that to be a model unit, a single model unit like a vehicle, a dreadnought, something like that, or a big monster to offer that lookout, sir. But again, that remains the same as previous. So the biggest one there that does affect the Death Guard, of course, is Armour of Contempt. So as I say there, it was an annoying rule to deal with, in my opinion. You know, you'd let your opponent know the AP of the attacks that have got through, and you might reduce the AP for them because you know they've got Armour of Contempt, because you do as well. And they, oh, right, okay, so it's AP 2, so it's 2 down to 1. I'll say, oh, no, it was 3. I took it down to 2 for you, so you're on AP 2 there. And it just ends up with that back and forth where you're both trying to be courteous. They're both trying to make sure the game flows as quick as possible. But it's 2 minds. It's not 1 mind all linked up, and you end up having to have that back and forth sometimes, slowing the game down unnecessarily. And as it goes, I don't think it really addressed the issue that it was trying to address, which was that it was trying to give Marines really a step up against the competition, because as a fairly elite, not necessarily the most elite, but as a fairly elite army, they needed some kind of way to keep those models on the board a little bit longer. And as it goes, I think with the removal of Armour of Contempt, the streamlining and reduction of points across the Astartes as well as other models as well, ultimately I think that addresses the requirement a little bit more, which is that the game was a little bit killy to make them feel relevant, so something had to change to make them more relevant. And I think just having a few more models on the board is going to do that far better than improving the save across more than half of the factions that you could run into in the game, particularly if you count the individual chapters as separate factions. Now, of course, Votann will still have Void Armor. It is what it is. They're still going to have Armor of Contempt, essentially. But whilst Iron Warriors and Salamanders will now essentially retain Armor of Contempt as their chapter tactic, that means that no wound rerolls is going away for Iron Warriors and Salamanders. And whilst you're not going to run into Iron Warriors and Salamanders every game, or maybe you are if your friend plays them, but the bottom line is, coming up against those matchups now is far more effective for a Death Guard player, being able to reroll ones on the plague weapons, being able to actually utilize Arch Contaminator against pretty much everything except Votann. So all of a sudden, taking Arch Contaminator out of the list as a, well, I don't want to end up running into somebody where I can't use it, is less of a concern now. So I think you can lean into Arch Contaminator and have a bit more confidence, unless you run into Votann, and then it is what it is. Some armies are going to counter you. But the top and bottom of it is you've got a worse save on every model against any amount of AP, with some point decreases or free war gear to compensate for that. The HQs have remained unchanged. Now, of course, they are all affected by Armour of Contempt. They are all Armour of Contempt benefiting models, but on the flip side, they're not necessarily the first models that take damage in any given game. If they are, you need to work on positioning those models a bit better to benefit from Lookout Sir. So whilst, yes, they are reducing the save of those models to an extent without changing their cost, ultimately, they're not going to take that damage that early in the fight. And again, on the flip side, when they are attacking into an opponent that would have had Armour of Contempt, they're now getting the benefit of that extra AP in a lot of cases. On top of that, the Death Shroud are unchanged. They do still retain their free extra sprayer or spurt gauntlet on the champion. And from the looks of it, based on it not listing the chime as a cost, it would suggest... Where are we? Putrefier... Death Shroud, yeah. So there's no cost listed for the chime, so it would appear the chime is now a free upgrade as well as the extra sprayer. I still think I'd go with the extra sprayer, but there is some utility in going with the chime, particularly if you want to use Flash Outbreak, because they will not only count as a turn further up, but they'll have the plus 3-inch range on the contagion from the chime, and they'll have the contagion that you've shared, presumably, from Flash Outbreak. So whilst that's sort of an upgrade in a way, being able to take the chimes for free, I would suggest that Death Shroud are largely unchanged and have essentially just taken a nerf. But besides that, there are some pretty good upsides, I think, to the loss of Armour of Contempt. So your Plague Marines have gone down a couple of points each, which is a pretty big deal. It's essentially 10% in value. So you're now in a position where you could actually feasibly run 100 Plague Marines in a list. And whilst, yes, with no Armour of Contempt, they're going to be easier to remove, I'm not sure there are that many armies out there that really have the output to get rid of that many bodies that have -1 damage. The sort of army that would expect to do that would be reliant on flat 2 damage weapons removing individual models, but of course that's not a thing against the Death Guard. You're going to have to do it either 1 damage at a time, or you're going to have something that's flat 3 or better. And again, there are not that many armies out there that have the number of shots to remove so many Plague Marines with flat 3 damage weapons. Now, again, I'm not advocating for the 100 Plague Marine spam list, but I think the fact that they've gone down in points along with so many of the other units will mean you can probably squeeze in an extra squad of Plague Marines to back up that flank. So even if you do lose the first squad, you've got another one there to come up in and claim that objective again for you. Again, the flip side is true. I'll stop banging this drum. But again, if you're into an army that previously had Armour of Contempt and has now lost it, something like the Mace of Contagion with AP1 is actually doing something now rather than being on the base save. With that flat 3 damage on the Mace, it does feel that bit more relevant now to have that extra AP actually do something. I would say you are probably less likely in any given game to end up leaving the squad on just a few models left with your champion and 2 cleavers, or a champion, a flailor cleaver, however you might want to do it. You are, in this case, more likely to end up with that squad being wiped. But again, you could roll well and it still happen. It is still going to happen from time to time. And those particular weapons, in my opinion, turn those units into mini characters that can really deal with some big threats. And so I think that the reduction on the Plague Marines is, to me, unexpected. I would have expected them to stay as they were because I thought they felt a bit cheap before this change. But I'm glad to see them reduced, and I'm glad to see them retaining that free war gear. I still think they've got a phenomenal place in the list. On top of that, one of the changes to Warzone Arcs of Omen is a change to grind them down. Now, in principle, the secondary itself works exactly the same, but it allows you to generate a CP if you were using troops to kill an enemy unit. And of course, Plague Marines fairly killy if they can get in range with those melee weapons, so it's not going to be that uncommon if you take grind to generate a CP as Death Guard. So just to reiterate, in case you're not familiar, grind is a secondary, or grind them down is a secondary that would require you to kill more units in this battle round than your opponent kills of friendly units. And it specifically kill enemy units, not killing your own stuff, which of course Death Guard can't do really anyway. So the top and bottom of that, you've still got pretty good durability across the army. Having that extra toughness is effectively a -1 to wound in most cases, and you've still got that -1 damage, so it's mitigating the efficacy of flat 2 damage weapons. You are still going to be able to get cover saves in a lot of instances. So again, you're not necessarily going to be on that much worse a save anyway. You might be on a 2 up going to a 6 up now, where you may have had a 5 up previously. It is still going to push more damage through on average, but you would hope you can still retain some of those models and be able to strike back in an effort to claim that grind. So I do think grind becomes a more interesting secondary for the Death Guard, and that in turn puts some stock in the Plague Marines, because otherwise you're probably not going to expect to do it with Poxwalkers or Cultists. I think larger squads are still the way to go. I think I would still be running 10-man squads of Plague Marines, because they are still difficult to remove and will help with that grind if you want to take it. Moving on to the elites there, so the Blight Lords now get free war gear, which is not as big a reduction as some. Looking at the Dark Angels standard assault Terminators at 33 points with a Storm Shield and Thunder Hammer, Obsec, which, Blight Lords have got as well, but also built-in Transhuman and can't fail morale from Inner Circle. I think they're a little bit undercosted as it goes, but hopefully we'll see some change to that in the future. But either way around, Blight Lords are getting free war gear, and they do retain Obsec along with the Death Shroud. On one hand, I think, that is a buff. You're essentially saving 5 points on a loadout that you might have wanted to take. But it does now mean that you're not going to see a squad of Blight Lords with bolters and swords, or, bolters and axes, or a mix, because there's no real incentive to do that. Why would you take a combi bolter when you can have a combi melter, or a combi plasma, or a blight launcher, or a flail? you wouldn't in most cases. So I do think it narrows down the way that Blight Lords work a little bit, because I just can't see any reason why you would really want the AP0 bolters over any of the other choices there. Again, you're not even losing the melee weapon to upgrade the bolter to a combi melter or combi plasma, so there's no downside to doing it as such, but it is now sort of funneling the Blight Lords into being that mixed ability squad, some with more anti-tank choice, some with more anti-infantry, some perhaps just with a melee weapon if you go with the flails. So I'm not as big a fan of that as a reduction. I would have preferred Blight Lords to go down to 35 points and the war gear still cost 5. Ultimately, if you go with the upgrades, you're still in the same cost region anyway. Otherwise, if you don't go with the upgrades, you are rewarded for taking the bolters, which otherwise are not a fantastic weapon for anything except chaff clearance. So again, I do think against the likes of Chaos Space Marine Terminators, the Blight Lords have done very well. Of course, Chaos Space Marine Terminators didn't really see any improvement for the loss of Armour of Contempt. I think it's partly their own fault for Black Runing, Mark of Slaneshin, and Delightful Agonizing them alongside Illusory Supplication. But again, I don't think that the Terminators themselves are the issue there. I think it's the ability to stack so much on them, along with the Black Rune, that is the issue. I think if maybe they changed that to character only as a relic, the Chaos Terminators probably could have gone down and it wouldn't have been that big a deal. But I do think the Blight Lords into many other Terminators outside of the Dark Angels look like they're at the right point cost for what they do if you're taking all the free war gear. The Fetid Varian, they've come down across the board, so chances are, through these point reductions, whatever your list might be, you've probably got room to chuck in an extra Fetid Varian now if you wanted to, so you can make use of a buff that otherwise wasn't in the army. Maybe you want to chuck in a Talisman and support your Blight Lords with a +1 to hit, or maybe you weren't running that Plague Surgeon, and now that the Armour of Contempt's gone away, suddenly that 6-up Feel No Pain and the ability to heal a model looking a bit more relevant. Again, I would say the Plague Surgeon probably lines up that bit better alongside Terminators than it does Plague Marines. But again, that 6-up Feel No Pain on the Plague Marines could be the difference between keeping them alive and not. And again, that bit cheaper, you've come down roughly 5-10 points a model across all the Fetid Varian. You're going to be able to fit an extra one in most lists. Again, alongside the HQs, your Fetid Varian weren't typically in the front rank taking hits or getting shot because you could Lookout Sir protect them. So the fact that their save has got that little bit worse, in the grand scheme of things, I don't think it changes your first few turns. If you lose their Lookout Sir protection, perhaps as a result of being less durable, then yes, those Fetid Varian may well go down that bit easier. Fetid Bloat Drones have effectively come down by 5 points on the basis that their Flesh Mower is now 3, and that's probably the best loadout in the current meta. That flat 2 damage with 12 attacks can get through a squad of infantry fairly well, particularly with Armour of Contempt going away if we're looking at a Marine or a Sisters enemy model. And the Blight Haulers have gone down 10 points, which makes a lot of sense. Attack Bikes, ATVs, they've both gone down for Space Marines. Blight Haulers are a very equivalent model, just higher toughness. They've got an invuln, and they've got slightly more heavy output in terms of having the missile as well as that multi-melter. So it makes sense to me that they would come down 10 points as well. And also the Miasmic Malignifier, which I got right for a change, has also dropped a little bit down to 65 points. So it's a bit less of a tax to take, despite essentially being a piece of metal. It was considered Heretic Astartes, so it did gain Armour of Contempt, so it has effectively seen a nerf, but again, dropping in points, a bit less of a tax now if you wanted to take it, and whilst it's, it does a bit of stuff, for me, more of a fun model than a seriously competitive model, though I'm sure, a competitive player could probably find a use for one. So for me, the biggest winners there really are still the Plague Marines. The fact that grind now rewards you for the troops getting kills, and the fact that Plague Marines are still as deadly, if not more deadly, really makes grind look quite nice, alongside just still running many Plague Marines. 2, 3, 4 squads would not be unrealistic, and that's at 10-man size. The Blight Lords and Death Shroud, I don't think have done so well here, but again, they've still got the 2-up save, they've still got the 4-up invuln. Not that many models out there remove invulns at this stage, so it's not that dangerous a predicament for them to be in to lose Armour of Contempt, but I do think that compared to some of the top Terminators now, they perhaps feel a little bit overcosted, but against things like the Chaos Terminators, perhaps they feel like they're in the right place. The main thing for me would just be addressing the Dark Angels, because Inner Circle is such a big buff that I don't think they should be the same cost as other Space Marine factions that don't get all of that. I think the Fetid Varian have won out here quite well. Coming down across the board, I think we'll probably see an extra Fetid Varian in a list that previously couldn't fit one, or those extra points being able to spend on more Plague Marines, more Terminators to protect those Fetid Varian and keep them churning out their effect for longer into the game. On top of that, the companies, I think the second Plague Company is now in the ascendant. Increasing AP 0 to AP 1 didn't have that broader value previously. Of course, it would into Tau, Necrons, Eldari, you know, all your Xenos factions. But against Imperium and Chaos, outside of Demons, well, including Demons, I suppose, increasing that AP didn't really matter. Now that Armour of Contempt's gone away, it's only really Demons and Votan and specifically Iron Warriors and Salamanders that won't care about you increasing AP 0 to AP 1. So I think that makes Death Shroud, alongside the second Plague Company, feel that bit better, because the number of hits from those sprayers at AP 1 suddenly makes them feel that bit more dangerous. On top of that, because the saves have been reduced, having that additional AP could remove a save entirely from an opponent where they might previously have had a 6-up, even with Ferric Blight. So I do think second Plague Company starts to become more interesting, specifically for that contagion. Backed up by the stratagem, very good stratagem, adding 2 inch to the range if the opponent is charging the unit you've selected, and a solid relic generating wounds by killing models to put back onto demon engines. So of course, if you're planning to run demon engines, you're planning to run Death Shroud, and particularly if your opponent's playing an army that wants to make at least some charges, second Plague Company is looking very nice. And also, of course, third Plague Company still looks good. Gloaming Blow, still a very, very good contagion. I don't really like this propensity to, I'm turning off your rules, because some armies, like, that's all they've got. So I don't really like that, but of course, third Plague Company, still very strong, undeniably. I think fifth Plague Company, the Poxmongers, is looking that bit better as well. The Demon Engines, of course, having a 5-up invuln base for their Demonic Invulnerability save, minus 2 AP now takes them to that Demonic Invulnerability. Minus 2 AP, that bit more common than AP 3. So ultimately, they're more likely to end up on that 5-up invuln because of attacks made by the opponent. Therefore, the relic to dish out a 4-up invuln is going to get more use, because it would only take AP2 to put them in the position where they're benefiting from that 4-up invuln. So I think the second and fifth are looking slightly better as a result of that change, both in offensive for the second and defensive for the fifth company. Overall, I think a list probably has saved around about 10%, let's say, depending which direction you were going. You've probably got about an extra 200 points if you were leaning into any of these units. Particularly, you'll have saved 20 points across any of your Plague Marine squads. You'll have saved a smattering across any of your Demon Engines, and you will have saved across any of the Fetid Varian you take. I think perhaps 200 is perhaps a bit of an exaggeration. You've probably saved more like 100, maybe a little bit more. But again, that is very easily an extra squad of Plague Marines that can guard the back objective for you and leave the other squad that perhaps should have been doing that free to move on up the board. So thank you so much for watching. If you've got any points that you think I've missed or you just want to share, please do feel free to get involved in the comments. I always read them and I will certainly get back to you. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time in the Underhive.